Okay, right, what we're going to look at today is we're going to have a look at how you answer a question on a sources question on the Night of the Long Knives. Now, the question itself, if I click away for a moment, is how useful is source B for an inquiry into Hitler's consolidation of power in 1934? Now, on the exam itself, you'll have two sources in which to answer this question. So each source is roughly worth 4 marks each. There's 8 marks up for grabs. And in order to get these 8 marks, you can see here, you need to provide a judgment focusing on the inquiry. You need to explain how nature, origin, purpose affects the usefulness of the source. More on that shortly. And you need to use your own knowledge to make a judgment on the usefulness of the source. Okay? So we're going to come back to these in a moment, but I think the first thing to establish is the context and the facts surrounding the Night of the Long Knives. So let's have a look at that. So, upon becoming Chancellor, all Hitler's dreams have not yet come true. So, although Hitler is Chancellor, he has, with good reason, some worries. So let's have a look at some of those worries. What could be threats to Hitler? Now, of course, one of the major threats is that although the Nazis are the largest party, they haven't completely dominated everybody. In fact, they've lost some votes on the election of November compared to the election of July in 1932. So there are concerns that Hitler is going to have. So firstly, there's a threat of political opposition, because those who did not vote or would not want to vote for the Nazis are going to have to be brought into line. The way that he seeks to deal with this is he passes a law. All of this, of course, comes from the enabling law of 1933, of March 1933, is the formation of political parties is banned. So, bans new political parties, and that includes existing political parties, in July 1933. Now, as I mentioned, this was made possible, and lots of what we're going to talk about here is made possible by the Enabling Act, or enabling law, because really, once it gets passed, it becomes law, of March 1933. This is the one you'll remember where you've got the SA stood outside, keeping the communists from coming in under the emergency decree, and it passes, and that gives the Nazis all sorts of new control and effectively leaves the Reichstag powerless. Okay, so political opposition. In addition, when we're talking political opposition, is of course the Communist Party and the Social Democrats are now banned. So they don't exist. Well, officially, they're not allowed to exist. Another area which could pose possible problems, and if you think back to the early days of the Weimar and the issues of the Spartacist revolt, the Kapp Putsch, and even the Munich Putsch, there is a problem of regional assemblies in Germany. Germany, remember, is a young country and people think very regionally. So what happens to combat the potential regional powers is quite simply the Nazis get rid of them. So from January 1933, we get state governments are abolished. Now, maybe because it's not the most exciting or dramatic, that often tends to be forgotten by students, and I don't think it should, because Germany is a country made up of regional power bases. So demolishing those regional power bases is a big, important step. Another threat, potentially, to the Nazis' power, which Hitler acts to remove, is the threat of the workers. Now, the banning of the Communist Party means one of the chief ways in which workers might seek to rebel against the new Nazi regime has been taken care of. Another is unions, where people from the same type of industry get together and effectively organise to go on strike if what they want doesn't happen. So, quite simply, these trade unions are banned. They're actually replaced with a government-controlled version that's from May 1933. Where else do we have problems? Well, potentially we could have problems from religion, because people have their faith, their belief. So if the religious groups threaten, challenge the Nazis and what they're trying to do, then that's going to be a problem as well. So we've got religion. Again, to combat that, we have the Concordat with Roman Catholics. In July 1933. That's important to mention, as you remember from what you will have done in your revision and looking at previous lessons, is that the Catholic Church doesn't support Hitler throughout this process. They realise actually reasonably quickly that they've been sold a pup, they've been lied to. So we even get, the papal bull, which directly criticises Hitler, but by that point he's kind of dealt with it. And the Protestant church in Germany is brought under government control. Okay, so political opposition, jobs are good 'un. Regional powers, jobs are good 'un. Workers, jobs are good 'un. And religion, jobs are good 'un. However, where things aren't quite so good is there are three other threats which Hitler is concerned about, and there's limited opportunities he's got to deal with them. So one threat that he can't do anything about is Hindenburg. Now, Hindenburg is not a big fan of Hitler, as we know, and Hindenburg has the power to remove Hitler, and Hindenburg has the power to ignore Hitler and use the Article 48. Now, Hindenburg helpfully makes things easier by dying, but that isn't something that Hitler has any power over, and he's certainly not able to or planning to try and knock off Hindenburg with some dodgy purge. So for now, Hindenburg remains a problem, but if Hitler can demonstrate to Hindenburg and other conservatives that he has their best interests at heart, then that's not going to be as much of a problem. So speaking of conservatives, a group who are politically conservative and skeptical of the Nazis is definitely the army. Okay, so the army could remove Hitler from power. Now, I know they've been stripped back thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, but they still have that capacity, certainly to make things very difficult for Hitler. And if Hitler's to achieve the aims that he has, such as overturning the Treaty of Versailles, then he's going to need the army to do it. Furthermore, we've got potential internal threats. Now, that means from within the Nazi Party. Now, Hitler, remember, seized power, took control when he came out of prison. And you could pick out someone like the Strassers, who was still around potentially, but the big threat really comes from Ernst Röhm. Now, Ernst Röhm is going to be potentially a big problem for Hitler because he has 4 million SA soldiers under his command. Now, that's unofficially because Hitler is in control of everybody, but the concern that exists is that if Rome asks them, it's a bit like if there's two people trying to have control of a dog. They both call for the dog to come to them, and we see which one it goes to. They have ultimate authority. So there is a real concern that if Rome decides to try and use the power he's got from these soldiers under his command, if they obey him, he potentially could turn them against Hitler. And then he's in trouble. But that's not going to be a problem because, as we've seen already, in the Enabling Act, it was SA soldiers who made it difficult for people to get in and vote and intimidated them. The SA were crucial in roughing up communists and dealing with the political threats. The SA were even used to help quell the workers. And ultimately, the SA have been a very important part. So why is this causing a concern for Hitler? Well, it comes down to the issue of what comes next. Because Ernst Röhm argues that now they're in power, now they've consolidated their power, we need to see a socialist revolution, including dramatic steps like the army being absorbed into the SA, like the rich industrialists, those who bankrolled Hitler's campaign, having their wealth removed. It's very much the socialist part of the NSDAP, verging on communism, and something that Hitler vehemently disagreed with. Because Hitler, by contrast, sees the next stage as a period of stable, careful government, where Hitler can enact his plans for Gleichschaltung, ultimately leading to a future position where they may be able to expand and move to a warlike phase, but not yet. And the concern, of course, is that Rome in his socialist revolution is hated by the army, is a huge concern of the army. And the army, of course, could remove Hitler from power. So ultimately, when Hitler makes a decision as to whether he favours the SA under Rome or the army, he goes for the army. He sees them as being more important to him at this point. So that's the context of the Night of the Long Knives. Let's have a look now at how this transfers to a particular question on the same theme. So the question. Okay. The question is, how useful will a source be for an inquiry into Hitler's consolidation of power in 1934? We get this source for us to identify. Sorry, let me just come out of that. Here we go. Right. So it's from a speech by Hitler in the Reichstag on the 13th of July 1934. So it's less than 2 weeks after the Night of the Long Knives starts, which of course wasn't a night. It was actually over a long weekend. But the long weekend of the Long Knives doesn't sound quite as good. I ordered the leaders of the guilty to be shot. If anyone asks why I did not use the courts of justice, I say this. In this hour, I was responsible for the fate of the German people, and I became the supreme judge of the German people. Now, when we're evaluating a source, ultimately, we want to get as much out of it as we can, as clearly as we can, and really as quickly as we can. Clarity and efficiency is the name of the game here, because ultimately, for each source, you're only talking 4 marks. So the approach we're going to go for, partly because of my obsession with Star Wars, is we're going to bring in our beloved Ewoks. The Ewok J is what we're calling it, because it follows these different focuses. Inquiry. What are you being asked to do? What does it tell us? That's where we're going to focus on the content of the source. What can we learn from it? Origin of the source. Now that really covers nature, origin, and purpose. What type of source is it? When, where was it made, and who said it? And purpose. What was the intention of that source? What was the reason behind it? Knowledge. That's where you bring in your own knowledge. You weigh up what the source is telling you against what you know. Can you support it? And I can't stress enough, this question is all about usefulness. It's not asking about bias. It's not asking about reliability. It's not asking you to criticize the source. It's asking you what can you gain from the source. And finally, your judgment. Your judgment on how useful it is and why it is useful. Okay. So I'm going to go through and talk us through how we're going to answer this. And we're going to follow this model of the Ewok J. Okay, so the first thing we need to consider is the inquiry aspect. Now, if I just move this slightly to the side. Okay, so as you can see, I've attempted a sort of here's one I made earlier approach, where I've set out some of these key aspects that we need for each area. You wouldn't in an exam need to do a full plan for this. It's not a good idea. It's going to take too much time. But obviously when we're practicing and when we're at this stage, it's a good idea to be making plans following the Ewok J format. So you know what you're going to write, and whilst we're at this stage of practicing, rather than trying to worry about exam conditions and that kind of thing. So the first thing is the inquiry part. So we can say that source B can be considered, tell you what, let me move that down a bit. That's better. Can be considered useful for an inquiry into Hitler's consolidation of power in 1934. Wow, what a thrilling sentence. It isn't at all. It's very much a case of playing the game, I'm afraid. We're just highlighting that, yeah, we know what the question was. I know, but it's something that we need to do. On to more interesting stuff. What does it tell us? Now, I've picked out here that what it tells us is the people who opposed Hitler were shot, the legal system wasn't used, and Hitler claimed all responsibility himself. You could also, as I put here in the inquiry, point out this is all about the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives. Okay, so I might say the source is focused on the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives in summer 1934 where Hitler dealt with internal threats and in doing so secured the support of the army. Okay, so again, kind of bring on my own knowledge in a little bit. Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to stick to this in too much of a rigid fashion. It's more of a point to make sure you're including all these elements. But I think it's important just to make it clear that you're aware of how this fits into the wider issue. So again, what does it tell us? So Hitler's total responsibility is confirmed in the source as he describes himself as the supreme judge. The source states that there have been killings of opposition leaders and that this was not in response to legal proceedings. Okay, so Hitler is responsible. He's accepting responsibility for all that happened. We've done most of the heavy lifting now. We can go on to the origin of the source and then the knowledge. So the origin of the source, the Reichstag speech was made by Hitler as German Chancellor, demonstrating the importance he placed upon giving an official public justification for the events he ordered. So it's useful in that way because we can see that the purpose of all this is to show that Hitler has made decisions on behalf of the whole nation. It's demonstrating the fact that he said this shows that he believes it's important that this comes out, because Hitler does not regularly make speeches to the Reichstag. If anything, he doesn't believe that it's important. Okay. Also significant is the source being just 2 weeks subsequent, which means afterwards, subsequent to the events, showing they remain important. You think today, and quite often something, if I asked you to guess what the headlines were 2 weeks ago, other than something about coronavirus, you'd probably struggle. But with something that is running on, which is important, it's clear that something needs to be done to address it. So obviously, a bit like the Capitol riots of Donald Trump, and that idea, that event is that people feel that something needs to be done about it. Okay, so we've got a knowledge and purpose. We've said what it is. It is a speech, so it is attempting to persuade people that what Hitler's done is acceptable. Okay. In context, now context means what's going on around the time that it's happening. I prefer that to saying my own knowledge tells me, or from my own knowledge. I don't like those. I don't like reading those as an examiner. I don't like reading those as a teacher. So try and avoid the from my own knowledge, I know that, and try and take other ideas. So in context, the events reduced the influence of the essay empowering Heinrich Himmler's SS and securing the loyalty of the army, which was later confirmed by an oath sworn to Hitler. The division, the division between Hitler and Rome over the future direction of the party had led to a ruthless purge. Overall, the source is very useful in highlighting the need of Hitler for his actions to be recognized as in the interests of Germany. Okay? So just to go through again, and there is more here than you would need. I've gone for a very full answer. Source B could be considered useful for an inquiry into Hitler's consolidation of power in 1934. The source is focused on the aftermath of the Night of the Long Knives in summer 1934, where Hitler dealt with internal threats and in doing so secured the support of the army. Hitler's total responsibility is confirmed in the source as he describes himself as a supreme judge. The source states that there have been killings of opposition leaders and that this was not in response to legal proceedings. The Reichstag speech was made by Hitler as German Chancellor, demonstrating the importance he placed upon giving an official public justification for the events he ordered. Also significant is the source being just 2 weeks subsequent to the events, showing they remain important. In context, the events reduced the influence of the SA, empowering Heinrich Himmler's SS and securing the loyalty of the army, which was later confirmed by an oath sworn to Hitler. The division between Hitler and Rome over the future direction of the party had led to a ruthless purge. Overall, the source is very useful in highlighting the need of Hitler for his actions to be recognised as in the interests of Germany. Now, if we're considering how far that fulfills the criteria, let's just return ourselves to what paraphrased as the mark scheme of the question. I'll just move out of the way. Gives the judgment focused on the inquiry. Yes. Explains how NOP affects the usefulness of the source. Yes. O knowledge is used to make a judgment of usefulness. Yes. Okay. There we go. Thank you.